that the minute you grind it, it becomes rancid. Not the minute, but it starts deteriorating the minute it's exposed to air. And that's why I used to think that whole wheat flour was kind of nasty stuff, because my whole wheat flour is even older because I used it less frequently. I mean, the more I didn't like it, the less often I used it, and the worse it became. So what happens is that there's a lot of oil in the germ, but there's also oil in the bran that can start going bad. And when I started grinding my own flour, I discovered that it was absolutely delicious and hardly bitter. You wouldn't say bitter as much as had an interesting flavor, an earthy flavor. And the reason that people sometimes think of that earthy flavor as bitter is it's phenolic acid that's in that bran part of it. And they've actually developed a flour called whole wheat white flour that doesn't have phenolic acid. That's why it's white, and it never has the true flavor of whole wheat. It also isn't quite as heavy. And it's interesting that whole wheat flour has the highest protein of any flour, and yet it doesn't behave well in a bread because it just doesn't have any elasticity. Wheat flour is the only kind of flour that has a sufficient amount of the two proteins called glutenin and gliadin. They sound like two gladiators, but when they're combined, they're called gluten-forming proteins because it just has the potential to form gluten. And when they're combined, they can actually absorb 3 times their weight in water. So they're fundamental to the structure of when you're making bread, you want a high gluten flour. But the reason that the whole wheat doesn't do much to supply you with this stretchability is because the bran is still in there, and the bran is like little scissors or knives, and it cuts right through those strands that are forming thanks to the water, so you end up with a dense and heavy bread if you don't add vital gluten. I have a recipe on the blog that I originally did for Food Arts magazine. I called it my whole wheat epiphany loaf, because I found a way to make a whole wheat bread that I really loved, and it wasn't quite as dense, and it had 100% whole wheat. And it is on the blog if anybody's interested in trying it. Except the water first. But really, my epiphany in grinding flour happened when I saw the wheat berry, what happened when the wheat berry gets ground. Growing up in New York City, I'm used to seeing things coming from the supermarket. And so I never had a concept until I went to the country of eggs and milk and things like that, and certainly flour to me just came in bags. But when I had those wheat berries and I ground them and I saw the powder come out and I saw the separation of the, you can't see the germ, but of the bran, that's the coarser in the flour, it was like, oh, this is so beautiful. And so I happened to do some research by calling some of the millers. And I actually told one of the millers that I was very excited about this. And I said, well, you must think I'm really silly to get so rhapsodic about grinding flour when you do this, hundreds and thousands of pounds every day. And he said, why do you think I'm doing it? I felt the same way the first time I saw it. And you just can't imagine, unless you see that stream of flour coming down, it's so basic to everything that we do and everything we are. And certainly as a baker, it's the foundation of my life, of my work life. By the way, I didn't mention that the 2 types of protein, glutenin and gliadin, have 2 different functions. Gluten has a stretchy quality like a rubber band, so if you pull it, it pulls back in. Now, if you're making a challah and braiding it, you don't want to have that kind of elasticity because it will shrink up and not look good. You want to have the more of the gliadin type of flour. And then it becomes extensible, which means that you can just stretch it out and braid it beautifully, and it has the strength to puff up nicely. And that's why, well, Gold Medal, a few years ago, created with Didier Rosado, who's a very famous baker from France and an American baker, what's called Harvest King Better for Bread flour. And it's a flour that it's made from 100% winter wheat. The winter wheat is harvested in the winter. That means it's grown in the south. So although it's high in glutenin and gliadin, it also has a lot of gliadin. It's a softer wheat, and it has great extensibility. And it's more similar to the flour from France that everybody's always raving about, that you get such a better texture, you get more lift, because a lot of people think, well, gluten, it's stronger, you're going to get more puff. But because it doesn't extend itself, you don't get quite as high a rise. So, and of course, differences in the flavor of flour really depend on what type of flour you use and what part of the grain it comes from. So the 3 most critical parts of flour are the variety, the protein content, and the freshness. And if the flour has been bleached, it keeps just about indefinitely if you keep it airtight. or if you're not in the tropics where it's absorbing water. But unbleached flour starts to deteriorate after about a year and a whole week. With whole wheat flour, I use it within 3 days of grinding, or else I have to wait 3 weeks because the enzymes will interfere with the baking. And then you can continue using it for up to 3 months. But if you don't, you should freeze it, and then you won't get that rancidity. As quickly anyway. It keeps very well in the freezer. The hardest flour, there are 2 types of flour basically. There's the whole wheat flour and there's the white wheat. White wheat flour is made from the whole grain, but the germ and the bran are entirely removed. And there's still different types of flour within that depending on where it's grown. Flours that are grown in the Dakotas and Minneapolis they're called spring flowers because they're, it sounds like a flower that's growing in the spring, but they're planted in the spring and harvested in the fall. And durum is one of them that is 14%. It's as high a protein as whole wheat before the bran has been removed. Because all the protein really is close to the bran. There's very little protein in the center of the endospring, of the flour grain. Durum flour is fantastic for pasta, but it has absolutely, even despite its high protein, very little gliadin. It has very little elasticity. So if you're making pasta, it will break. But you like the bite, you know, the al dente. So that's why it's used in pasta flour. And it's cut with another flour that will give it more elasticity, an all-purpose flour. A flour called high gluten, which is also made from red spring wheat from the Dakotas and from the north, that is what you do want to use for making bagels and things that you want to chew to. Or if you're using some grains that also serve just the way the bran does to cut through gluten strands, you want to add more gluten so that you can give it more strength and it doesn't become a heavy, coarse bread. I'm going to get to cake very soon. In fact, I'm approaching it with all-purpose flour because all-purpose is around 11% when it's bleached, but if it's unbleached, it could be 12%, which is pretty high. I mean, Harvest King is 11.7%, and that's the bread flour. So a lot of people use unbleached flour for bread flour as well.
What percent
Of protein.
in general?
Exactly. But the thing is that, well, the bleaching helps to deteriorate it, and that's why the unbleached has a higher one. But it's very hard to know, and it's a natural product, so you can't say, well, it's going to be exactly that, because it depends on the harvest as well. But flour companies try to blend things so that they get more standardization. But even a fraction of a percent will make a difference in the way it performs. And because now you understand that if the gluten is capable of absorbing 3 times its weight in water, that if you're using a higher protein flour, and you're making a bread dough, for example, it's going to be really stiff because it needs more water. It's absorbing it and stiffening it. So it used to be all a mystery to me until first I started doing it and trying out different things and seeing the differences, and then I started reading about it and asking different millers, and I was lucky enough to meet the head tech person at General Mills, and he's absolutely brilliant and can answer everything. So if he says that something hasn't quite been figured out yet, I know to go no further, except back to the lab, so to speak, to try it out and see myself, so I can say, well, you may think this is what it's supposed to be, but this is what's happening to me. Another very important point about all-purpose is that you'll see cookbook writers write nationally available, use a nationally available all-purpose flour. And the reason is that if you use a local flour, for example, White Lily from the South is an all-purpose flour, but it's only 9% protein. That's hugely lower. I mean, it's almost like a cake flour, and yet they call it all-purpose. It's a great flour for biscuits, but if you try to make, and cake even, but if you try to make bread with it, it won't rise.